Uh, Hello and welcome to this panel discussion on Percival Everett's 2024 novel, James. This is part of the English faculty's Black History Month, or Black Futures Month, as other people like to call it, programming. And I am Nicole King. I am a professor and tutorial fellow at Exeter College, and I'll just take a moment to introduce our other panelists very, very briefly, and start our discussion with some opening comments. So we have joining the conversation today Casablanca Adu, who is an alumnus of Oxford, having done her MST here, Eliza McCarthy, who is a DPhil student here, Anna Lee, who is a MST student here at the moment, Professor Kirsten Shepherd-Barr, and Professor Elika Bomer. So welcome, everyone, and welcome to the audience out there. What I'm hoping is that if you have not yet picked up Percival Everett's novel, that after this conversation, there you go. And I have a slightly different cover. I bought it. Oh, Kirsten has that one too. So yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite books of 2024. For those of you who are watching this, and this is pre-recorded, but so whenever you happen to be watching it, you may know that this is one of the 2024 shortlisted books for the Booker Prize. It was also nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in the United States. And Percival Everett is an author that you may have encountered without realizing you've encountered him, because one of his most successful books was made into a film in 2023. And the film was called American Fiction, and it was nominated for an Oscar. I believe it won an Oscar. And it was based on his 2002 novel called Erasure. So Percival Everett is an author, an incredibly prolific author. He has published 33 previous texts, at least 20 of which are novels. But he also writes essays and he writes short stories. And he is a professor. He continues to write. He's a professor at the University of Southern California. His 2021 novel, The Trees, was also nominated for the Booker and shortlisted. There are too many Percival Everett books for me to list here to recommend to you, but certainly The Trees and Erasure are some of his most famous. But I think also I'm really delighted that we're having this conversation because he is an author that until the last couple of years has sort of gone under the radar. However, people in the know suggest that he is one of the most important contemporary writers, and certainly one of the most important American writers at the moment. So by way of introduction to James, one of the things that you may or may not have heard about it is that it has a very important intertext, which is Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, which is a book that most people will have heard of, even if they haven't read it, or if, like me, they hadn't read it for a really long time. And I put myself on a regime. I said, I have to reread Huckleberry Finn before I read James, because I knew how important an intertext it was. And I suspect that some of our conversation today will revolve around that intertextuality. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn revolves around the story of a young white boy named Huckleberry Finn, and the adventures that he has with a runaway enslaved person called Jim. And James, by Percival Everett, is an attempt to, I would say a very successful attempt, to give depth and dimensionality to that figure of Jim. And we get to that immediately with that sense of naming, right? So he does not have a nickname. He has his full name. Other people call him Jim. He himself calls himself James. And I think that is a wonderful entry point into a discussion of the text, or a sense of what this text is doing. It is not a rewriting of Huckleberry Finn. It definitely does retrace and reimagine key elements of Twain's very famous and very controversial novel, and perhaps we'll get into that as well. Although I would like this to be, as much as possible, discussion of James as opposed to Twain. We might need a follow-up discussion of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. But there are a few points that I wanted to make. I just have a few notes here. And that is that it is that Huckleberry Finn is not the only intertext. And I'm just going to throw out some potential ideas or facts about the book that we maybe can pick up in discussion. And one is that, like many texts, there are some paratexts, some text that comes before the novel actually gets started. And what's interesting about James is that what comes is titled The Notebook of Daniel Decatur Emmett. And we then have song lyrics. And in reading up for today, these Daniel Decatur Emmett is an actual person, a minstrel performer, and he appears in the text. And what we have are lyrics to songs from minstrel performers. And so maybe a question that we could approach is, why is this the way that Percival Everett chooses to open his text? And it just put me in the mind of autobiographical novels of slavery by people like Harriet Jacobs and Mary Prince and Frederick Douglass. And those texts from very, very popular in the 1840s and the 1850s and the 1860s around the US Civil War often had paratextual elements as well. What some critics have called a black message encased in a white envelope. I will leave it there. I've already spoken too much given the terrific panel we have gathered here today. And I wanted to open it up in terms of how we'll proceed. I would ask each panelist, beginning with Anna, to talk for about 5 minutes, maybe about your impressions or questions you've had about the text. And then we can open up into a general discussion. Anna, take it away.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And it's lovely to see everyone here today. I think it goes without saying that I thoroughly enjoyed this book, not just as a matter of, aesthetic appreciation, but also because Percival Everett is just an excellent writer. His prose and style is something that's extremely enviable. But the way that I approached James, well, not to bring Twain into it too much, but of course, that is, sort of the founding of it. I first came across Mark Twain's books when I was middle school, high school. I read the more abridged versions and then graduated to the more, mature versions, the real ones. And to say that I was a little bit shocked would be an understatement, I think, especially growing up in communities that were predominantly people of color. But I really appreciated Percival Everett's rendition here, his ideas that he employed, especially with the idea of code switching, which is the movement between diction with white versus black characters, and themes of education as well. For example, that scene where he instructs the children to speak a certain way to cater to white preferences. I found that extremely intuitive. And also, Nicole, you made an excellent point about the sort of intertext or paratext that's going on here. And I also appreciate that James isn't just responding to, say, the idea of Emmett's book, but also the books that came before his own re-envisioning of Twain's book. So I think there were some additions before that also sort of sprung out of here. For example, I think there was an author who named James' wife Sadie, and that was sort of how it got incorporated into Percival Everett's rendition. I could be a little bit wrong on there, but feel free to correct me if so. So I just saw it as a sort of like launching pad for greater creativity and insertions on Everett's own. The idea of critical fabulation really came to me, and that's a term that sort of refers to the re-envisioning of history through, the people who have been archivally erased. So yeah, overall, I just super huge fan of Everett. Can't wait to read more of his works. This was actually on our reading list for my master's class, and I actually am such a big fan of Percival Everett that I dug in before I was supposed to. But I have no regrets about that. It was very good. Um, so yeah, those are some of my main impressions so far, and I'm interested to hear what others have to say. I know that wasn't exactly 5 minutes, but yeah, just a lot going on in here.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Anna. I wonder, Casa, if I could turn to you next.
Sorry, just needed to unmute myself. Yeah, sure. I kind of wrote a bit of a script because I'm a bit, interested with speaking, so I hope it makes sense as I go along. But I'll begin with the quotes. It's on pages 21 to 22 of Percival Everett, James, obviously. Never address any subject directly when talking to another slave, she, Lizzie, said. What do we call that? I asked. Together, they said, signifying. Throughout and after reading James, I questioned whether James ever left the performative realm. If he let, so to speak, his guard down, if ever introduced us to substantial James, let us beyond the veil. I suppose in truth I struggled with this novel. So I struggled with this novel. It reiterated things we already knew, We know we're not languorous, superstitious, or witless. We know the portrayal of Jim in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Twain is just what it is. Racist, bearing no semblance to reality. We know if James were real, he probably yearned for his family and was angered by the injustices and inhumanities, by the sadistic cruelties which framed his world. We know many enslaved persons, as described by Mel Watkins in his book And the Real Side, put on an obsequious social mask in order to deceive the oppressor as a form of resistance. What more was to be said? What more was said? To me, then and now, nothing. Yet as I rested with this nothing, I began to rest with it. If on one receptive modality, James, the novel, spoke to the falsehood of the minstrel, the true intricacies of Black life in antebellum America, followed the formulaic slave narrative, on another, it cruelly satirized the very notion of Blackness, articulating the disappearance of its titular character. James, as with race Blackness, was nothing but the performance of his nothingness. Indeed, the truth behind one performance is but another. The book ends, yet the act never truly concludes. The actor never materializes. And who are you? I am James. James what? Just James. That's on page 303, I think. Rid of, or rather, having shed the minstrelized, inverted commas, persons, that is Jim, James is but a mimic of the Fenonian Antillean. The novel toils with its reader. It feigns an invitation to Black interiority, to the private language of enslaved peoples. We laugh in dramatic irony at the ignorance and stupidity of its white oppressors. For we, the audience, are let into the Black interior, that space, as defined by Elizabeth Alexander, in quotes, behind the face of stereotype and limited imagination. Or, in the words of Daniel Fuentes Morgan, that private realm of Black thought and feeling beyond any expected performance of Blackness. And yet, beyond the performance of Blackness, we witness another performance. What a cruel joke. When James discards his mediator's speech, slave filter, code-switching, as Anna was talking about, his mastery of standard English reveals an intersubjective realm of colonial subjugation. A Fenonian reader would argue that the more adeptly James assimilates the language, the more he abides by its grammatical dictates, the more he performs to the raced world order. Not shocking, the master's tools, in inverted commas, after all, were never dismantled the master's house. Hear Voltaire's explanation of equality on pages 49 to 50. It conjures the ghost of Fanon. Equality is, in quotes, the capacity for becoming equal, The same way a black man in Martinique can so become French, he can also acquire the skills of equality and so become equal. As the attainment of equality is read in tandem with the acquisition of language, a parallel, a connection is drawn between the two. To speak French, to become French, is to become equal. To become equal is to perform in proximity to whiteness while maintaining a race inferiority. And thus, to speak the colonizer's language without alteration is to perform whiteness. Therefore, when James is not performing stereotype blackness, he enters the stage with white philosophers, enacting a two-hander in near-dramatic dialogue, recalling the plight of King Richard II, the delirious monologues in Shakespearean plays. He performs. Must we accept this, a debate with Western philosophers on the doctrines of their world systems as indicative of black interiority, of the enslaved private language of James unveiled? How brutally satirical. It is as if the performance never ends, the curtain is never called. James's identity, black interiority, is continually deferred. Much like the slapstick humour of the minstrel show, where a black man pretends to be white to pretend to be a black man, much like the minstrel show itself, where a white entertainment form mocks a black entertainment form that mocks a white one, there is no true subject, no central being, just a hall of mirrors. Butler's performativity, perhaps? Perhaps. In fact, James, the character, may be read as a Derridian trace, as a simulacrum of presence that dislocates itself, in inverted commas, displaces itself, refers itself, and having no sight, erasure belongs to structure. That's in Derrida's margins. James is, after all, the simulacrum of a false presence that is Jim. His self is drawn from him not being Twain's Jim. He's both the spectre of Jim, a racialized falsehood, and that which whose construction is haunted by Jim. He's an uncanny repetition of his stereotype predecessor. In this way, James signifies as absence, a negative identity who is a negation of and different from Jim. I suspect this is a failed reading. Perhaps James is there. Perhaps there's a black interiority, a black private language beyond performance. Perhaps it is just not addressed directly. Perhaps it is signified. I wouldn't be shocked. Everett is not a fair writer. Anything that a writer says is suspect, he admits in an interview with the White Review. He plays language games. He implores us to never directly address any subject and calls this, opposing any understanding of linguistic interpretation, signifying. I'll reread the beginning quote. Never address any subject directly when talking to another slave, she, Lizzie, said. What do we call that? I asked. Together they said, signifying. Is this lack of subject addressal the basis from which Everett enters dialogue with his audience? Is this a black private language? Yes, Everett is an unfair writer, or perhaps I am an unfair member of his audience. Maybe I did not perceive black interiority, James as a fully fleshed person, as anything more than a performance because I lived behind the Duboisian veil. Okay, sorry, I finished.
Thank you very much, Casa. I've been taking notes, and I think everybody else is taking notes on what you and Anna have said, and we'll circle back and pick up points of mutual interest, of which I'm sure there are going to be many. Eliza, I ask you what your initial thoughts are on this text.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having us all here and for chairing the discussion, and to Anna and Casa for all of your insights so far. They're really fascinating. I can't wait to return respectively to both. I primarily was quite interested specifically in the presentation of the river and the kind of riverine space in the Mississippi. Coming to James as someone who has actually never read Huckleberry Finn, I feel like I arrived very fresh within the narrative. So I didn't actually know that it was a rewriting, well, not a rewriting, but a kind of an engagement with Twain's text as I was reading it. So I kind of arrived at that knowledge a little later as I was reading it, reading around it. So I just actually wanted to start by looking at the cover. So in my copy, we see James here striding through the river as if there's no obstacles. His kind of fist is very clenched. His gaze is very much determinedly forward. And then if we go into the front cover, we're kind of met with this map that's kind of very much like antiquated, very archaic, almost nautical map of the river, and it's kind of really compressed into the space, and the style of which it's been drawn is very kind of antique. It's almost like it's temporarily suspended in a space that's kind of very abstracted. You see this snake is almost as big as the entire southern border of Illinois, and this large pencil, and it kind of renders the river space as a space of kind of like it's like a make-believe space. It's almost a fantasy the way it's been drawn here. From what I've read, the river in Huckleberry Finn, it's almost like a character within the tale itself. It's a space of rugged masculine endeavor, of white kind of masculine power and play, symbolic of freedom, and is the main artery towards freedom. Whereas in this book, though it is seen as the primary kind of route towards freedom for James, it's fraught with continual danger and threats, just kind of cartographic confusion as well. It's continually a space where alternative literary modes become amplified, the fantastical, it's a place of a lot of action. It's a place I see as a real space of suspension in the novel. It's often seen as land is as if it's a place where Black life is not permitted to thrive, yet the river is hardly a place of safety either. So the kind of binary between the aquatic is safe and the terrestrial is dangerous is continually broken down. And also I would say that kind of north towards freedom and south towards enslavement is also continually troubled by Everett in the narrative, not only purely on the basis of the actual geography that the river follows. There's one point, I think it's at the start of chapter 22. Let me try and find it in my notes. There's a very noticeable kind of narrative change where, yes, so yeah, on I think it's 22. It's when passing south between Missouri and Illinois before meeting the Ohio River, the Mississippi makes a couple of massive bends so that at one point she's actually heading slightly northwest, then loops back around and heads south again. All I really wanted was the Ohio. So there's kind of the way the river is narrated in this book is pedantic precision and kind of the big chase. There's one moment on page 137 where this is deliberately mocked. So the man says, the Mississippi River, the big river, man river, old blue, what are you going to do with the river, son? It's big, wet and deep. Brings it down as a that once refuses to be kind of under that kind of white male like dominion. And there's another point on a very similar vein where it's never relegated to a kind of weird natural majesty. It says the problem with being lost on the river was that things appeared different facing south from north. It was as if there were two different bodies of water. The Mississippi, in fact, seemed different rivers. The level was always rising and falling. So the way
Eliza, I'm just
throughout
going
this
to
river
for one second. Sorry. No. Just you're breaking up a little bit.
Oh, so sorry. I'm in the faculty.
So we're getting the gist of what you're saying. No.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Would you like me
I just
to?
wanted to say, can you just repeat that last comment that you made?
Yes. So I'm basically, the gist of what I was saying is that Everett never really succumbs to the romance of the chase for freedom and the kind of grand kind of image of the Mississippi River as we might have encountered it in Mark Twain. It's always kind of pictured through a lens of very much sober, like practical reality. There was one quote I just read that you might have missed on page 270, where it says, "The problem with being lost on the river was that things appeared different facing south from the way they did looking north. It was as if there were two different bodies of water. The Mississippi, in fact, seemed like many different rivers. The level was always rising and falling." So continually, just the very basic boundaries between land and water are troubled. When the river seems like a space, it often doesn't last for very long when there's a lot of on the river, and there's there's a lot of scenes of near drowning. And then on land, when the land is wet on the side of the water, it becomes dangerous, because there's one point where they get worried about their footsteps being traced in the kind of silty mud. So that I found very interesting. And also, what was the second part of this? Yeah, just the river as a space of kind of suspension. It's interesting to note that whenever these conversations with John Locke occur, they occur in the kind of aquatic space. So the first interaction where John Locke appears as this kind of gaunt figure, he walks out of the water, and then I think it's on, yeah, page 263, the river offers a space of kind of suspended temporality and almost comes to occupy like the ultimate liminal space. On
Liza, let's make this your last comment just for
Okay.
now. I could listen to you all day.
No, it's okay, I'm
I want
rambling.
to get to the group discussion as well.
Okay. Yes, it's a space where kind of James is removed from the temporal present and it's seen as a moment of kind of reflection. And that kind of sense of concrete memory is then entangled further when John Locke comes back in, and that's like even more temporally abstracted. So yeah, I was really fascinated with the kind of engagement with natural environments in a way that wasn't completely realist in this novel. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I just want to, for the purposes of our audience, thank you so much for bringing up the Mississippi River. So just it is 2,350 miles long. Mississippi is one of the major rivers on the planet. And much as Eliza was just saying, it was just integral to American life in the 19th century, but specifically to the slave trade. So you could not be on the Mississippi River and not be implicated in some way in the trade in slaves. And so that idea of being sold down the river, it's the Mississippi that is being invoked in that phraseology. So thank you so much for bringing that up. It's also really important, in fact, to Huckleberry Finn. And Mark Twain himself trained as a riverboat captain before he became a writer. So I think that is interesting. Okay, we've got two more panelists to hear from. I'm wondering if we can turn to Kirsten first, and then Alika, and then open it up. There's so many points with that to pick up here, and not a lot of time to do it. But Kirsten, over to you.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
great.
we can.
Thank you. Thank you so much for letting me join this panel. It's fascinating. And I just wanted to pick up on something that came up at the beginning, which is essentially the formal innovation of this text, which for me, it was completely staggering. The seemingly simple mechanism of having the code switching that was discussed as a sustained motif running through. And it made me think about other texts that just came to my mind as related to this one in such fascinating ways. One of them is Toni Morrison's short story Recitatif from 1983, in which she has two young girls. One is white, one is black, but we don't know which one is which. And it's an experiment. It's kind of thought experiment in kind of uncovering all kinds of assumptions about racial characteristics. that you're trying to pick up clues, and then you're stopping and going, but why am I thinking that would be a black characteristic, or that would be a white one? So there are all kinds of ways in which it makes you look at your own reading and kind of unconscious biases or assumptions, your reading practices. So that one came to mind. Also Colson Whitehead, because he too has these extraordinary imaginative feats. They're so innovative. So in the Underground Railroad, that seemingly simple thing of having the literalized railroad running underneath. So taking what was a metaphor and making it literal. And then in the Nickel Boys, I don't want to give it away, but there is an amazing moment, a narrative moment that you did not see coming, at least not this reader. And it really, really works, and it's extraordinary. Again, a bit like recitative, it just unsettles you in terms of your own assumptions. And I think we're seeing a trend here amongst these writers challenging assumptions. And finally, it made me think about Brandon Jacobs Jenkins' play from 2014 called An Octoroon, which is an homage to Boucicault, the great melodramatist, the Irish melodramatist Dion Boucicault. So in a similar way to Percival Everett's engagement with Twain, you have Jacobs Jenkins, rewriting essentially, although I think you're absolutely right, this isn't, Everett's not rewriting Huckleberry Finn, but Jacobs Jenkins is kind of deconstructing The Octoroon, which is a play by Boucicault, and he writes a play called An Octoroon, which engages with it, but it begins with a black actor, Brandon Jacobs Jenkins in the original, I think, and he is addressing the audience and he's putting on whiteface, and it's supposed to be lavishly applied over his entire body while he's talking to the audience. A bit later, just a few minutes later, really into the play, he then has, after that shock, he has three enslaved women speaking, Dido, Minnie, and Grace, and they're sweeping and they're chatting. And what's interesting is the code switching he uses there. So they're speaking as if they're like modern day, urban women. And then when white people turn up on stage, they switch to doing stereotypical slave speak. So it's really, really interesting to me to think about that play in light of what Everett's doing as well. And so I thought about that a lot when reading this amazing book. And I just wanted to say as well that there were two previous novels. One Nancy Rawls novel called My Jim from 2005 that reimagines Jim with much more emphasis on his family life, his wife. And that might have been the one that you were thinking of earlier, that one of the panelists was referring to. And then Finn is a novel from 2007 by John Clinch that really focuses on this character of Huck's father. So that's kind of interesting. These are kind of interesting predecessors in a way. But I wanted to say that Ron Powers, who is biographer of Mark Twain, wrote that Twain himself wrote a 5-act version of Hamlet in 1874 that was unproduced. And it featured one visible actor making humorous modern comments on the unseen action. This is from Ron Powers' book review of Finn from 2007 in the New York Times. And I would never have guessed this if it hadn't been for coming. I wouldn't have known this if it hadn't been for coming on the panel. So thank you. A little side effect of researching a bit into the background here. But I wanted to end with one thing that came out of a podcast that the New York Times did on James by Percival Everett back in March, I think. And it had Jumana Khatib saying, one of the things she said was, she absolutely loved the novel, but she said she felt that it was pushing it slightly to have, I'm sorry about the spoiler alert here, but to have Huck be revealed as James's son. And she felt that over-explained, in her words, over-explained some of the intriguing connections and bonds between the two. It sort of made that the reason they had the bond. And in fact, I really appreciated that comment from her, because that had been the one thing that I found for me was going too far. It was almost too neat to have that be this kind of revelation, you know, toward the end of the book. So I'll throw it open again. I just am curious what people might have made of that. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Kristen. Yeah, we can be critical of this amazing book. We should be critical of it. Well, we already have been. You're not the only one. And let's go straight to Elika, because time is marching on.
Hi, gosh, there've been so many fascinating remarks and insights shared already. I'm not sure how much I have to add, more just by way of kind of bouncing off, I think, some of the points made. I wanted, after finishing this book, to go back to Mark Twain, actually, because I read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn at school, and there was something about Huck Finn that I found incredibly appealing and attractive, and that I've never forgotten. And I think Twain, Everett retains something of that charm and that kind of insight and the smartness and the kind of cheekiness of Huck Finn. So I felt a little frustrated, certainly in the first half of the novel, because I kept thinking, you know, to what extent is this? I recognize certain scenes, like of the snake bite, for example, and so I wanted to go and excavate in the intertext. Like Eliza, I thought that, you know, there were kind of really two main characters in this novel, James and the river. The river, it comes through as a kind of living presence in the novel. It's extremely dangerous. It's extremely wide. You know, there's certain points where they can't see the other side. I mean, people expire in the river. There is an astonishing availability of boats. I think that on at least two, perhaps three occasions, they need a skiff. They're looking around for one, and there is one. And then also, because I suppose the river is, even though it meanders and winds and turns north again before going south, it keeps delivering up, you know, these mean and evil characters to undermine and to get in James's way and to threaten him, and to frustrate his path. And I was thinking by the end that it's almost a sort of mythical presence. I mean, it isn't a Styx, you know, the river of death that we cross, but there is something that is kind of transformative, and extremely disturbing about it. It seemed to me also to be a haunted river. You know, it claims lives. There's, you know, Huck's dead father, or the man he assumes to be his father. And also the pathway of the river imposes, which is a kind of quest shape to a narrative I really like. It imposes this and then structure on the narrative, you know, necessarily. And then, you know, that's only is broken when James finally makes a, you know, makes a bid for freedom, you know, armed and extremely vengeful. And also, we were talking a bit about maps. It's the first time that he decodes a map. I think it's, you know, he insists that the judge, you know, explains where things are relative to other things, so that he can go and reclaim his wife and daughter. So yeah, the picarist, I thought I mean, we've now delivered the spoiler about Huck's parentage. I'm with the New York Times reviewer that you mentioned, Kirsten. my heart sank at that point. And it was kind of, it's a big reveal, and then it's dropped, and obviously there must have been a relationship. It must, it's a story that's not unraveled in any way, although it is obviously something that is embedded in James's life, and it's one of his secrets. There's so much more, but I think, like Casa, I wasn't sure about the discussions with the philosophers, the Enlightenment, 17th century, 18th century philosophers, the theorists of enslavement, in fact, and of what counts as productive labor. I just thought the language was extremely, and in fact, it was helpful to hear what Casa was saying about it being a kind of performance of maybe some sort of white Enlightenment discourse, because I just found that the language extremely kind of flat and in a way unconvincing, but maybe I was meant not to be convinced. But against that, I thought Huck and James working together, there, and in particular how James labors. I mean, his body is extremely, is a kind of workforce. I thought that was very interesting too. But yeah, so there you go. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Alec, and thank you to all of the panelists. Clearly, we need at least another hour to unpick the points that you've raised collectively, not just the intricacies of the novel. So in a minute, I'm going to open this up to a more general discussion, because I think it's clear to me that we each have questions of one another. I think one thing a few points that I'm just going to use sheer as privilege to point out is that those sort of conversations with philosophers is an Everett sort of stylistic trope. He does that frequently, and that sense of reminding us that there's an author, this book is a construction, and we're bringing lots of other texts to the text that we're holding in our hands or reading on our screens, is very much in keeping with his style, or his style in some of his texts. I think that idea of critical fabulation that Anna first introduced to this conversation, and re-envisioning history, is really, really interesting, because it also reminds us how Percival Everett is a literary theorist, and somebody who teaches creative writing, but who's also very attuned, as one might imagine, to the sorts of critical discourses shaping literary study in the 21st century. Casa, I think, really honed in on such an integral aspect of this text, which is, do we ever actually know James? This text that purports in giving this Mark Twain character his full name, and his subjectivity that is absented from Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but actually, do we get there? And again, I would submit that is a question that Percival Everett would be delighted to see us asking. Can that ever actually happen? And there's so much more there in terms of intersubjectivity and on. But the performativity of the text, I think that's part of what I'm getting at. And of course, Kirsten got at some of that as well. Thank you for those other texts that we could think about alongside James, Recitative and Underground Railroad and the Octoroon. I think that sense of identity as performed is, again, an idea that Percival Everett just really returns to over and over again in various texts. I've already commented on some of what Eliza said I think that sense of the environment in this text, and the Mississippi River in particular. But I loved that phrase, the aquatic and the terrestrial, because they are continually intertwined. And I think that is, again, as I think I said a few moments ago, so also integral to Huck Finn. And yeah, that, as Alec just said, two main characters, the river and James, and so many boats. Okay, let's open it up. First come, first serve. Questions for one another or comments on what, let's all unmute and interrupt and talk over one another. Who wants to go?
I'm really intrigued. This is just a question, so I'm kind of passing the buck, Nicole. But I'm really intrigued what we all thought about the ending, with James heading off armed to exact his revenge, and we know he's ready to take lives. He already has killed somebody. I wondered about that vengefulness. I mean, you mentioned Fanon, Casa, but it's very Fanonian. that kind of cathartic, armed anger, very irrational anger.
But yeah, I think that was my favorite bit of it. I was reading it out loud with my mom, and that's when I really got into into the novel a lot. I was like, oh yeah, it's been freed, and finally, yes, I feel this. I will say, I heard one of the interviews I read over with Percival Everett. He was saying the difference, or trying to describe the difference between anger and rage, and how anger is the only way to instrument change. And I felt the book really showed that controlled anger, in inverted commas, through making sure he kept in a slight way to the original content Twain in the beginning, and that kind of allowed it to channel into this anger at the end. And yeah, I don't know what I'll say, but that's I just really like the end.
For me, I think it also reminded me, somewhat anachronistically, of the Age of Revolution, so the previous century, and the Haitian Revolution in particular, obviously the French Revolution, the American Revolution, but the Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture and others, really sent shockwaves across the United States, and became the impetus for more severe sorts of laws and crackdowns because of the fear of the sort of contagion of slave rebellions, and the sort of awareness of, oh yeah, there are more of them in slave, quote unquote, slave states than there are of in enslavers. And so that Everett is very much aware of that history without needing necessarily to invoke that, and that absolutely, I was thinking too of the catharsis of that Fanonian violence. But in that final chapter that it opens, as happens with the frightened and unprepared, we scattered. Some of us would be caught, some of us would be killed, probably some of us would go crawling back, which is not the triumph that you really want at the end. But again, that made me think of Haiti, in the sense that revolution was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. But Haitians have been made to pay for that forever onwards, up until this day.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, you go ahead.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I have to duck out in a few minutes, but yeah, I just wanted to say a few words about the ending chapter as well. We're sort of privileged with two perspectives that seem to contradict each other, as Nicole was pointing out. On one hand, we have, the historical truths that, not everyone is able to escape. And then also, the realities and perhaps triumphs of revolution. I think that, I don't know why I was reminded of almost a Tarantino sort of approach to it, in which revenge is sort of envisioned in an alternative reality. But I think that Percival Everett is sort of, you know, he's really grappling with this idea of like um, imaginary or like fabulation intertwining with history, and it's a very complex process. It's, you know, a winding one that doesn't always make sense, kind of just like the formation of the river or the structure of the novel itself. So I didn't actually quite know what to think of the ending. I thought it was, I was really, I was, yeah, I wasn't exactly sure what to make of it, but I'm interested to hear others as well.
Kristen, did you want to jump in? Thank you, Anna.
Well, I was going to ask if anybody before me wants to address that question about the ending, because I was going to turn to something else and I don't want to derail us.
I will say one thing, which is really interesting that you invoked Quentin Tarantino in terms of the cinematic scope. I think because American fiction has been so recently on the big screen, and was the first Everett novel to be made into a film. I was envisioning the film as I was reading this, and there are films of Huckleberry Finn, but I think similarly with The Trees, which, without doing any plot spoilers, has sort of a zombie element to it. And I could see that on the screen as well. And I just wonder, I have not seen this in an interview, or I haven't looked for this particular fact in an interview, but maybe that's a modality of writing that Everett is moving into. Go ahead, Kirsten. We have a few minutes.
That's really interesting. And I wanted to go back to something Eliza was saying. That would really open my eyes, what you said about the kind of fantastical, the hint of the fantastical without it being overt, and this is magical realism, and because it isn't, but that sense that it allows that possibility in through the depiction of nature, through the river, in certain moments. And I thought, what a great insight, and how there's a fine line here in the whole novel between wishful thinking, like, wouldn't it be great if that code switching were actually true, and wouldn't it be great if, you know, this whole rebellion were possible, and you could change history, and the novel is presenting us with that kind of thought experiment and wishful thinking in a way, but at the same time it's through this realistic, very gritty, violent lens all the time, the sort of gritty realism. And I thought I can't quite resolve that in my head. You know, what are those two things doing? It's a fascinating combination, allowing that little bit of the fantastic in now and then, in the sense of the way the environment works, perhaps, but still, and the whole concept is fantastical in some ways, but then you have this gritty realism. So I was curious whether anybody else was kind of wanted to speak to that, or had thought about those, whatever that combination is. I can't quite put my finger on it.
I think I'm quite
I mean,
oh, sorry. Do you want to go?
No.
Okay. Thanks. I think something that like a small detail that I feel like I kept noticing, but perhaps until now couldn't quite formulate a thought on, was the continual, like, almost frantic preservation of the diary and the paper and the pencil. Like, James always has to know whereabouts on his person the pencil is, and there's a kind of great need to really have that access to writing a narrative and making sure, like, his material possessions are there and, like, solid and kind of almost like ready to go, so thoughts and, like, memory and experiences can be kind of recorded, because there's almost like there's a risk of it becoming highly irreal and almost forgotten. So there's almost like, on the one hand, you've got a sense of realism through such gritty and, like, very graphic portrayals of encounters with the natural environment. A lot of the time, whenever I was reading descriptions of his, like, wet clothes, for example, and how he would cover himself in lead. I don't know whether this is just like my sensory issues with wearing wet clothes from getting caught in the rain so much. But there was that sense of realism, but there was also like a continual drive to kind of make it real through writing and kind of recording that experience. So there was like a continual, almost like desire to preserve the material, at the same time as these kind of more fantastical moments of interaction were happening. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but
it definitely makes sense. I think I'm glad you drew attention to that sort of regular need for James to hold on to the pencil, grab pencils, grab writing material when it got wet, to dry it out, to record his narrative. And I think so, because that speaks to the way in which the novel is not just in conversation with Huckleberry Finn, but is also in conversation with sort of a longer tradition of African American writing and lots of other writing. We've already mentioned Voltaire and Fanon, but that idea of the materiality of setting down a narrative, and that is how subjectivity becomes valued, especially in the face of the total evacuation of subjectivity that goes along with enslavement. And so that's a very continuous thread in African American letters. I think the other thing I wanted to say in terms of what Kristen was just saying about the sort of hints of the fantastical. Yeah, but I also feel like there are hints of the fantastical in things like the Underground Railroad, which makes Colson Whitehead's sort of de-metaphorizing of that so interesting, right? That there was this thing called the underground. We all as kids, this is what Colson Whitehead said. I was thinking, what? Where's this Underground Railroad? And so just the fact that metaphor sustains this network of subversives throughout the, suggests the sort of the presence of the fantastic alongside the mundane terror, everydayness of the terror of enslavement. Maybe one or two final quick comments, if anybody has them. We've just gone past the 1 hour mark. Any closing comments or ideas from anyone?
I have just one closing idea that I was going to butt in with a moment ago when Kirsten was talking. These remarks about the irreal and the fantastical and the de-metaphorical have been incredibly helpful for me to think again about my own question about the believability or not of Huck being James's son. I remember I was sort of troubled by the fact that kind of gets dropped as a plot thread, and we don't really hear very much at all, not even in Jim's memory, really about Huck's mother. But I guess it's almost unimaginable, isn't it? In the terms of it can't be captured through the lens of gritty realism, and it also can't be fantastical because it did in fact happen according to the premise of this novel. Because here's Huck, who's a real, within the novel, a real child. So yeah, it's very satisfying to me to have had, those different styles and forms to think about, which kind of none of them can actually release the story of is it Sarah and James from the story.
Thank you very much, Alika. One last thing I wanted to say in terms of the maps is that in this version there is no map, but in this version of Huckleberry Finn there is a map. It opens with a map. So I just feel like that's also, we always have to look at different editions and look at the covers. And thank you so much for unpicking the visual intertext and paratext of the novel. I'm really sorry. Kristen, go ahead.
No, I
Go.
was going to say, I wanted to shoot one last thing in there, but it's not, there isn't enough time to discuss, but it felt like we just needed to mark the presence of Sam. That episode where she, I mean, it's almost unbearable, but you know, that I guess I just thought that figures so heavily, so prominently in the novel, and that treatment of this white girl who has been continuously assaulted repeatedly and has this terrible death. But so it's doing something in the novel, and I'm not quite sure if it's solely to bear witness to the girl/woman's situation in you know, in this kind of context. But I guess we don't have time to talk about it, but I thought whether it had been on anyone else's mind as something really significant that is going on. Sorry, did I just say that she was white? She was not white. It was about her being trying to masquerade as a boy, I guess. And that's what James has to change his mind about when he first thinks that this young girl is actually a boy. And so there's this interesting arc that she goes through, and then tragically it's cut short. And I guess you could just spend hours just talking about that, but it just troubled me that she does just, as many who come into contact with James, she dies. And there's terrible suffering attached to that. And I don't know if James simply has to bear witness, if that's his role in a lot of these, just like with the slave who dies because he helped rescue James's pencil. There's so much senseless death. And so that in itself is not new as part of this novel, as part of American literature, but it's interesting why does he bring up these particular types of terrible deaths and terrible suffering? And I wondered if people felt that was done in a way that was leading to something, or are they simply episodes that sort of stand by themselves? So I know we don't have time for it, but it felt that we needed to sort of bring it up, just like with the pencil, I suppose.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, though, Kristen, because I think that might be a useful place to end, in the sense of the dimensionalities of this text, that Everett manages this sort of, you know, it is the adventures of Jim, you know, it's not called the adventures of James or Jim, or Huckleberry Finn in the Wind, which Twain titled his text. But we follow James on a quest, as somebody said much earlier, and there is extraordinary carnage, not just due to the institution of slavery, but because of the particularities of James's desire to free his wife and his daughter, to be reunited and to free them. I think that sense of the collective versus the individual is something that your comments raise. What is the collateral damage when focused on that nuclear family versus some greater good, in quotation marks. I'm so sorry. I think we have to we have to stop now. Other people have other places to go. There are many events happening here at the University of Oxford. So I would just like to thank once more each of you, Anna Lee, Casablanca Adu-Adunkor, Eliza McCarthy, Elika Bomer, Kristen Shepard-Barr, all part of the Faculty of English community. Thank you for this really, really fascinating discussion of James by Percival Everett.